Good morning, welcome to the March edition of Money Talks, the WASBO webinar. I'm Mike Berry, Executive Director, and welcome to a very snowy Friday, at least in this part of the state. I'm glad that we got everybody back home from the accounting conference yesterday before all this weather hit. So thank you, by the way, if you were at the accounting conference. So we are joined this morning, as always, by our charming and delightful co-host, the Director of Business Services for Menasha Joint School District, Brian Adesso. Good morning, Brian. How are
Good,
you?
good morning, Mike. How are you? My head's still spinning from the accounting conference.
Is it? You got your money's worth?
Definitely got my money's worth.
Yeah, I think we should give out little sample sizes of Excedrin on the way out. It's sort of a care package. So yeah, there's a lot of snow here, and this is a good reminder for all of you who are responsible for building budgets. Never transfer money out of the snow removal budget until about the middle of June. It's just you never know what's going to happen. Because I thought we were done. Oh well. So I would like to introduce our special guest today. Stephanie Leonard Whitty is the Assistant Superintendent for Teaching, Learning, and Equity at the Sun Prairie Area School District. Good morning, Steph.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for including me this morning.
Well, we're delighted to have you here, and I suppose you don't have any budgetary problems because you have Phil Fry as your financial guy. Phil Fry, the financial guy.
Yeah, Phil is probably disappointed that I spent a lot of money on instructional materials since he had to do snow removal today. So sorry, Phil. Sorry.
Well, I'm sure every dollar was well spent, as always. I had the pleasure of working together with Stephanie for a number of years when we were both in the Oconomowoc area school district. And when we were thinking about this topic of Act 20, I thought, Stephanie, that you would be a great person to try to sort of explain all of this to our audience. There's this phenomenon where the business folks are busy doing business stuff. And when there are initiatives that are coming through the legislature that are instructional, at least it was always my experience that you tended to kind of be aware of it, but not really. You didn't really unpack it because it's like, well, the instructional people have got that one. But then when it comes with financial implications, you can sometimes get caught a little flat-footed or a little unaware, right? It's like, oh, okay. And that's really the purpose of doing this webinar today, is to explore not so much the sort of pedagogical aspects of Act 20, but really just to talk about the practical realities of it and how it might affect resources and so on. So are you up for the challenge?
I'm ready. I'll try to not go too far into reading instruction and stay high level with what it means.
That's right, because we have all financial people on this webinar, and we don't want them sending the eye-rolling emoji at us in the chat. We suffer enough in administrative team meetings listening to CNI directors, and we don't want to inflict that upon our members here on a Friday morning. So take it easy on them, would you?
I'm just ignoring that comment, Michael. We're good.
All right, that's fine. So that's probably the perfect answer. We've got about 40 or 45 minutes to spend together. And so we have a slide deck where I think maybe the first 15 or 20 minutes are going to be kind of about Act 20. And then the second half will be, we're going to look at Sun Prairie's specific expenditure budget, right? And kind of your rollout. And hopefully that will serve as an example for everyone to kind of get a sense of it. Now, you're a much bigger district than average, so we're going to have to prorate the numbers, but I think it's a great model to work from. So if everyone's ready, let's dive in. So So there's the there's the names. Okay. Oh, it gives me a chance to do a special shout out to Laura Adams over at DPI. Um, at least half of these slides were adapted from slide decks that she has prepared and shown around the state in her role as sort of the ambassador of Act 20 these days. Okay, so let's start with the why. Stephanie,
Thank you.
what's going on?
So the state statute for Act 20 is aimed at improving poor or lagging reading scores across our state and nation. You can see by the data on here that about 1 in 3 kids in Wisconsin are proficient at reading by the end of 3rd grade, and the same would hold true across the nation. Also of important note is that in Wisconsin, we have the largest gap for our Black or African American students when it comes to reading outcomes. There's data that is widely supported that would say that a person's lifetime earning potential is tied very closely to their ability to read at the end of 3rd grade. So they're numbers we need to be paying attention to and thinking about in service of ensuring all kids are prepared for life after they leave the K-12 systems. So Act 20 is modeled after similar legislation across the country. Mississippi was the first into this game in 2013, and now we're one of 37 states and the District of Columbia that has similar legislation to try and improve reading outcomes across our country.
Thanks. I don't want to be flippant about this. I'm certain that the challenge around the reading proficiency is multi-dimensional, but I wonder if it has occurred to our legislature that after 12, 13 years of consistently underfunding K-12 in the state, I mean, like not even keeping up with inflation for that long, that may have had some impact, right, on staffing levels and on ability to do interventions and bring in new materials and so on. So maybe some of our chickens are coming home to roost, right? And as for Mississippi, I should say that their program, it gets a lot of attention, and but the numbers there are different. When they did this, they went all in on a $650 million effort, and we're doing the $50 million version, not the $650 million version. So I hope that, or I fear this might be too much of a bit of a half measure, but we'll see. Okay. So there's a lot in this Act 20, isn't there?
Yes, all the major components are listed on here.
I tried to put a little asterisk next to the components that might have a budgetary impact at the school district level. And so like creating a statewide office of literacy isn't going to affect anyone's budget at the local level,
Right.
nor will the literacy council itself. But with the way that, like the third one, how we have defined science-based early literacy instruction, isn't that sort of the root of everything that follows, like all the materials we're gonna have to purchase and the training and all that?
Absolutely. It's really a matter
Mm.
of what you're currently using and how close or far away it is to the definition of science-based early literacy. And so that will make a big difference on how much this will impact your budget and your shifts in teaching and learning.
Okay. We've talked a lot about, or there's been a lot of attention paid to the reality that school districts are going to have to, many will have to adopt a new curricular materials, many, but not all, right? Again, as you just said, Stephanie, based on how closely they are aligned already. There is a partial reimbursement, which I think has been the subject of attention at sort of the WASBO level. We're going to talk about that more later. And then obviously the professional development, right? Administrators and teachers.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is sort of overview slide. We're not going to unpack every one of these components. We wanted to start here because if you're if you're at your administrative team meeting, whatever you call it in your district, your senior leadership meeting, and you hear the district administrator or the director of instruction start to talk about this, that's the time to, perk your ears up because there's expenditures that are related to a lot of this.
And Mike, these are really important topics that really span all the leadership, levels. It's not just curriculum. It does span over to business, and we should all know this stuff too at a high level.
That's right. Yeah. What's more important than than reading at the K-3 level, right? Okay. So some of these slides that follow here will go a little bit into more depth on that overview slide that we just showed. But again, this is not meant to be something that we're going to, this is not the sole focus today. More of an overview. Okay, so Office of Literacy and statewide literacy coaches. What should we know about that?
Sure. So this does not have a financial impact directly on districts. The Early Literacy Council has been formed, and the state will be employing 64 full-time coaches. I believe that will be in conjunction with CSAS, but that has yet to be determined. And those 64 full-time coaches will be distributed or dispersed into districts to support the work of early literacy. A lot of unknowns there, but that's the intent and the support that the state will be offering, likely in conjunction with CSAS. And then this all holds true until 2028.
Okay. Well, that sounds like quite a challenge, finding 64 full-time equivalent literacy coaches. That might be a bit of a challenge. We'll see how that works out. And of course, this is what often happens with legislation. It's on the DPI to do the reporting to joint finance, right? So DPI is going to have a lot of skin in the game because they're going to be held accountable, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. And then the Office of Literacy and the coaching program sunset on July 1 of 28. Okay, well, we'll have all the reading issues resolved by July 1 of 28. That's good news. Okay. Let's talk about the state grants for curriculum. I
Absolutely.
apologize for that font. That font is somewhat headache-inducing as I look at the slides, especially at this time of the day. What can you tell us about this one?
Absolutely. So for districts that need to adopt new instructional materials to meet the expectations of evidence-based literacy instruction, there are going to be funds available for possible reimbursement. I believe it's 25 million total to be divided across the state, with up to 50% of what you purchased being reimbursed. So for Sun Prairie, that meant $1.2 million for our universal curriculum adoption. And we've been told it's not likely that we will receive 50% of that. And so if you purchase materials based off of the list of 4 that have been approved by the Joint Finance Committee, there is the possibility for reimbursement.
So that sound you heard was all the business managers falling off their chairs when you said 1.2 million. I should remind everybody that Sun Prairie is a very large school district, and we're going to have to break that down and prorate it for your more typical district of 1,000. We're going to do that later in this webinar. The state funds, I understand I think it's 2 iterations of 25 million. But I think the key for school districts to focus on here is that where it says the state will pay for up to 50%. I would be very cautious about assuming that means 50%, right? I would probably caution that maybe using 25% is a safer number. And as you'll see later, there's no revenue coming to the school districts, no reimbursement until 2026. So if you're a budget builder, you're responsible for the 24-25, construction of that budget. It's all expenditure. It's no revenue. Good morning, and thank you for joining us. Yeah, it's all expenditure, no revenue for next year. So that's why we're on here, right? This is an opportunity to keep everybody aware of some of the potential challenges. So then the next bullet talks about LEAs, obviously local education agency or school districts, as I like to call them, and choice schools who adopt a recommended early literacy curriculum after, and we highlighted this, March 12th of 2024. Now I have to warn that I saw a different PowerPoint weeks ago that said adopt after January 1 of 2024. So this has created some uncertainty in my mind. It's either January 1 or it's March 12th. And that's a big if. And we're going to have to get that cleared up. Because I can't speak with absolute authority on it, I just want to highlight it, right? And we're going to have to figure it out. So Stephanie, in Sun Prairie, what was your timeline looking like for purchasing materials? Are you going to be on or after March 12th, or did you go earlier?
Our board approved it March 11th. Our board approved the expenditure, and then we placed the order on the morning of March 12th. So we were
On or after?
right. We were operating under the assumption of the January rule. In fact, Dr. Nick Rykoff, who's also a member of this group, had reached out to ask, you know, if we purchase things earlier, then approved by the Joint Finance Council, will it count? And the response was not clear. And so we are also unclear, but grateful we placed our order on March 12th and not before.
Okay. So I think it's safe to say if you're purchasing after March 12th, you're obviously in the clear. That's a little bit of uncertainty between this January 1 and March 12th window. But I'm glad it worked out for Sun Prairie. I'm glad it worked out for Phil Fry. Okay.
But we're still not getting reimbursement until 2026.
Yeah, so be aware. The money it's a long lead time on this. And even that 26 number a year was, they weren't super specific. Maybe they can't be at this point. So, you know, our friends at DPI are obviously, you know, they're processing all this and trying to make up the rules as we go. So I don't want to sound like, you know, we're being harsh about that. It's just that what we're doing here is getting out early with this information rather than waiting until every last question was answered, because you're building budgets right now. So so that's the situation with the materials, but it's not just any old materials, right?
Correct. And so one comment I just want to share about, I do appreciate that DPI is wrestling with something that is really unusual, right? As a local control state, DPI is not usually involved in the selection of instructional materials. Typically, they bring forward the standards we need to teach that we adopt, and then our local committees and groups and school boards adopt the materials we want. So it is uncharted territory, at least in my experience in Wisconsin in the time I've been a leader here. So, and you're right, it's not just any materials. The Joint Finance Committee approved the 4 that you'll see on the screen here on March 11th. These 4 came from the Early Literacy Council. The Department of Public Instruction also submitted a separate list, its own list with more materials on it. The DPI list was rejected by the Joint Finance Committee. The Early Literacy Council recommendations, which are listed here, were approved by the Joint Finance Committee. So if you adopt any of these 4 sets of materials, those are materials that you can apply for reimbursement, again, up to possibly 50%.
Okay, thank you for that. So the DPI had a recommended list of 11 sources that they believed would provide the curricula to meet the standard. Joint Finance went a different direction. They had a committee that they had formed or appointed, and they came up with the 4 that we just showed, right? So how do I ask this? It seems to me that it's kind of an interesting landscape. And I want to pause on this for a minute. So let's say that you're a school district that just so happens to have early literacy curriculum that exactly aligns to the science of reading standards. That was just the way you were rolling, right? In that case, you might not have to do any new adoption, correct?
That's correct. As long as you meet the definition of evidence-based reading instruction with the current materials you're using, you're not compelled or required to adopt new materials. I think a key distinction is whether your instructional process is based on what's called the 3 cueing system, which is no longer allowed, as opposed to the evidence-based reading instruction, which is heavily steeped in foundational skills, phonemic awareness, phonics. And so many districts have been and are currently using a 3 cueing system, including Sun Prairie, which means we have to adopt all new instructional materials to meet the expectations of Act 20.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so as to this partial reimbursement grant business, as this slide explains, this was drawn from an email that Tom McCarthy sent out from DPI just the other day. I think it was on Tuesday of this week, saying that the grant period will begin March 11th of 2024, covering any costs made after that period begins. Congratulations, Sun Prairie, for hitting that just right. And then again, that the percentage of the reimbursement is going to be prorated, and we just don't know what that proration is going to look like. Okay, so districts, this is the point that I think Brian really wanted to drive home, right? Which is that reimbursements may not are unlikely to happen until what, 2026?
Yeah, so that could be fiscal year 25-26 or 26-27.
Right, right. Good Lord. That's quite a lead time. Okay. What are we trying to explain here?
Well, this is that reading pedagogy stuff that the people like me are worried about in your system. So
Oh, that.
yeah, exactly. Do you know how a child learns to read? That's what we're going to talk about now. So
Okay, let's give it a try.
this is the research that some of you have heard the term science of reading. Of course, in the state statute, it's called evidence-based reading instruction, but these are the things that would need to be present in the instructional materials, either the new materials that you adopt or materials that you're using, and really a focus on pushing back to foundational reading skills. Phonemes, so the letters and the sounds that letters make, and then phonics, like putting those letters together, like how does that form different words? And then of course, things like vocabulary building. Another big difference that I would say is new in this evidence-based instruction is that it's heavily focused on knowledge-based instruction. So in previous instructional materials, it was you can read and write about pretty much anything you want within the science of or the science of reading or evidence-based reading. It's also tightly coupled with ensuring there's knowledge-based curriculum. So skills and knowledge tightly tied together is I'll say the big shift in this type of instruction.
Okay. For me, this means if you're a business manager and building a budget, that when the person responsible for curriculum and instruction comes to see you, this is real, and
Yes.
and you are going to have to deal with it
Yes.
in your budget. So
Yes.
okay, so you were starting to explain 3 cueing, a term that I was not all that familiar with. Can you walk us through that?
Absolutely. So this is what is prohibited or no longer allowed with Act 20 that many of us have been doing for a long stretch of time as best practice in reading instruction. So 3 cueing is at a very high level. It's teaching kids to read by using MSV strategies, meaning, syntax, visual. So if you've had someone in your house that's learned to read, probably over the past 15, 20 years, you'll remember them bringing home little books that say, I see a ball, I see a cat, right? And then we're using cues to have them read those books they know the pattern, they follow it along. I see A, and then they see a B and look up and see the ball and can, make that connection. And so we'd simply be prompting or cueing with things like, What's the first letter of that word? Use the picture cues. Go back and read it again. Does that make sense? And so the last thing we were asking kids to do was the V or the visual. And by that, going back to look at the letters in the word to make sure it makes sense. And what's coming forward is kids were learning to read by patterns and memorization and not building the word attack skills that they needed to build. So when you get to the upper grade levels where the pictures don't match and it's not predictable anymore, kids who need to have those strong foundational understandings to be able to break down words and break them apart didn't have that skill set they needed. So the shift is really like the V becoming the primary way to prompt kids to read, understanding the letters and how they blend together and how those words work. And then you go back and think about, does it make sense, or are there other cues or clues? And so that's the shift from the patterned words with those prompts to what we would now call decodable texts, where kids are still reading books that would look fairly similar, but with words that make them actually be more discerning about the letters that are in that word, not just picking a picture that matches based on a pattern or what makes sense in their mind.
Stephanie, would it be fair to say that if we're talking to a curriculum director and they're saying we're using the 3 queuing model, that we should expect some expenditures sometime in the future?
Yes. Yeah, a lot of districts are using Teachers College or units of study, or some people call them the Lucy Calkins curriculum. Those
Right.
are based in the 3 queuing system. Many systems use Fountas and Pinnell benchmark assessment. Those are also steeped in the 3 queuing system. So, and I would say that to the best of my knowledge, there are many districts that are currently using those materials, Sun Prairie included. And so I would say it's likely that you'll need to have a discussion around this. And this doesn't just apply to your universal materials, meaning what we use with all kids, but also the materials you use for tier 2 and tier 3 in response to intervention. And those are also heavily steeped in 3 queuing systems. So for many districts, it could be quite a shift.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to try to move a little quickly through these next few slides, 'cause I really want to get to budget implications and try to model that out. We're still in, what's required under Act 20. So in addition to these materials, which are probably the case in many districts, we also have PD.
Yes, and the PD I'm going to say is must do, regardless of what you're currently doing. So for your 5K through 3 teachers, there's required professional development, and for principals or administrators that are in schools of 5K through 3, very specific professional development that's required, and only through approved sources or groups. And there are certain criteria that they need to meet.
Okay, it's 5K, not 4K.
The law says 5K. We of
Yeah.
course are including 4K in early childhood in ours. Like, that's important for us to do that as well.
Yeah, that seems like it makes sense. So here's a more detail on what's required for administrators.
Yes, and I'll just really highlight the top part of this that I think is most important. For administrators of 5K through 3 buildings, they need to have 6 full days of professional development completed by July 1 of 2025. And this is everybody. So it's very, very unlikely that you won't have expenses based on this. There are very few number of districts that may have had this type of training in the past 6 months. So I would count on this being a given in almost every district.
And with a budgetary impact, local. Yeah.
Local budget
Okay.
impact. You figure out how to pay for it. Yep.
Okay.
Stephanie, if you bring on new principals, I'm assuming they're gonna have to go through the training?
Yes, it's my understanding it's within 6 months of being hired on in the system, and not just principals, but also teachers. So our new teacher induction programs for all our new staff will need to include that moving forward. And then as we bring new administrators on board, that'll be continuous training as far as I understand it.
Okay. I assume the CSIS will be heavily involved probably in organizing this or even delivering it. Okay.
Yes, that's, there are criteria that they have to meet, or any organization has to meet to be qualified. And I would say CISAs are, we're working with CISA 6. And I would say there are many CISAs that are going to be in this work and supporting districts in that.
Okay, great. So this is a slide about the screener, right? Can you walk us through this?
You bet. So the committee was intended to identify a universal screener that would be required for all districts at the end of 2024. That did not happen according to that timeline. So that's been pushed out. They hope that the screener will be identified by July 1 of this summer of 2023. It was supposed to be identified this summer, 2024. By July 1, we should know what that is. At this point, it's still required in the statute that we'll launch this for the fall, but it is assumed that Governor Evers will sign an amendment that would push this out for another year. So statute says we have to begin this in fall of 2024. There's an amendment that seems to be likely that Governor Evers will sign it and push it out for another year. But required screener for all 4K through third grade students in your district. And of course, you can see the frequency listed on there as well.
Okay. So the readiness screener suffers from a lack of readiness, as it were. Okay.
Exactly. Exactly.
You can only get that. You can only get that with us. Okay. So I'm assuming every school already has a screener, right?
Yeah.
So it could be a new and different screener. It could be one it replaces the other. It could be one's in addition to the existing.
All of the above. So
Okay.
all of us have a universal screener so that we can
Right.
meet RTI expectations. We used FastBridge, some other STAR, MAPS, iReady. Those are universal screeners that districts typically use 3 times a year. It's possible that the one of the screeners that we are already using is identified as the state screener, and it's possible it's not. And so we'll have to wait and see what that screener is and then adjust based on the needs we have for the screener for other reasons. And so this is a little bit of a wait and see approach, and then dive in as a district once it's determined what will be required to use.
Okay, that's 24, 25, but we're getting off to a bit of a slow start. Okay. So in addition to those really broad screeners, we have the diagnostic reading assessment. It's kind of a
Yes.
subset, right?
Yes. So you'll
Okay.
have the universal screener that will apply to all students. And then of the students that take that universal screener that score below the 25th percentile, then you need to do a diagnostic screener within 10 days of the administration of the universal screener for kids at the 25th percentile and below. In addition to that requirement, a parent, caregiver, or teacher educator could request that at any time and have it done within 20 days of such a request. So in really rough numbers for Sun Prairie, for us, that's probably going to be about a third of the kids in grades 5K through 2. That will likely be more or less for districts based on the level of poverty you have within your system. Districts with higher levels of poverty will likely have larger number of kids that are at the 25th percentile and below, just because of the barriers, young kids in poverty face to access education. Those
Right.
with less poverty will likely have less than that number, but will be about 1 in 3, most likely needing some kind of screener post assessment.
This is an interesting one. I think it just shows the challenges that come with big, broad, statewide legislative actions. If you're in a little boutique school district that's kind of wealthy and small, and you might have very few kids who would even fall into this category, and so administering this test within 10 days might not be much of a challenge. But if you're Madison or Milwaukee or what other big urban, that's a pretty tight window. So they're
Agreed.
going to really have to be on their toes.
Agreed. And it might be worth your time to just talk to people in your teaching and learning department to ask based on your current screener about how many, about how many kids would you need to screen, just to get a handle on, so what are we talking here? Like how many kids will we need to think about? And you're exactly right. Those of us that are better resourced and not don't have the numbers as large as other districts, it'll be easier for us to implement than others.
Right, it's gonna be a busy 10 days.
Hmm.
Okay. And then I'm gonna kind of just sort of gloss over these two. The school districts have to establish and publish a remediation plan, which is their overall plan, right, at the
Right.
district level as to how to do this work.
Yep.
That's a given. The school districts have to create a personal reading, or almost I guess you should say individual reading plan,
Correct.
right? And these are for the kids that we just identified.
Yes. Any
Okay.
child that's 25th percentile or below needs a personalized reading plan.
There's some work there too. So we're going
Absolutely.
to capture a lot of the costs that are really identifiable, but I think the point here that Stephanie was making is that there are the costs of time, right? Of more to do. And we don't necessarily capture that in the budget, but it's certainly more demands. So let's get to a budget impact type of statement. First, we have to give you some information about Sun Prairie so that you can compare yourself. You know, in terms of size of district. So 8,400 students, that must put Sun Prairie in the top 10, I would think, in the state in terms of number of kids, or close to it. 1,300 staff, 9 elementaries. You've got 4K early childhood, either in school or at community centers.
Right.
That's important. You've
Right.
got some title schools. Oh, there's a big one. ESSER funds are exhausted.
Yes.
Okay, well, I worked with you long enough to know that that's not surprising. Good for you. Um, um, you were bold and ambitious on behalf of kids. We'll put it that way. And
Always.
then Sun Prairie is relatively well resourced. As many Dane County districts are, in terms of your staffing averages and so on. Okay, so that's the background on Sun Prairie. So keep that in mind when we look at these numbers. I'm really interested in spending the rest of our time on this, because if I were a business manager and this was a little new to me, this is what I'd want. So I like the way this is divided. The activity, the estimated cost, that's for Sun Prairie, your possible funding sources, and then the timing of the action, right? So why don't we dive into this? We've got about 15 minutes or so to do this, so it should be plenty of time. Walk us through.
Absolutely. So the first row is the most expensive, of course, brings the biggest price tag, and those are the instructional materials that are not based on 3Qing and are based on evidence-based reading instruction. For Sun Prairie, for 4K through 5th grade, we just placed our purchase for 1.2 million, and that is universal, and there are some supports within that, meaning remedial kind of programming for kids within that. So for tier 2 and tier 3, that is a 6-year purchase, which has consumables. So for 6 years, that's the price tag for us to be able to have consumables for 6 years for our students within our system. Because we started early, we were able to get that in this year's budget. For most districts, I'm guessing it will come out of their 24-25 budget, and Fund 10 expenditure for almost every district, unless, well, based on title funding, I'd say count on that coming out of Fund 10. The next row is
May I,
oh,
before we move
absolutely.
on, a
Yep.
couple just about the possible funding sources. For purposes of this presentation, our default is Fund 10. I want to point out that it is possible that you might have the opportunity to use federal funds. But federal funds can be tricky, right? And it's like, well, which specific federal funding source are we talking about? And they're different, right? Title I is different than Title II. ESSER is different still. So because we could spend a half an hour just on that alone, our default here is Fund 10. We would encourage you to contact the federal fund folks at DPI if you've got a specific strategy around using federal funds. And it's a 6-year, so it's not,
Yes.
it's so that 1.2 million will give you 6 years worth of materials.
Correct.
Okay. And your scope is 4K not 5K.
Right.
And that was a local decision.
Yes, 4K through
Okay.
5th grade.
Okay. And then, so materials and then on to PD.
Yes, this line 2 will be a must-do for almost everyone, and that is professional development for your administrators for the 4K through 3rd grade buildings. And so 6 full days. That 9,000 for me is an estimate. I just estimated what it typically costs to bring in a staff developer for a day. We're contracting through CISA 6. You don't have to, but I think that most districts will end up going through CISA for that, and that will come out of Fund 10 for us in our 24-25 budget because it must be completed for administrators by July 1 of 2025.
So you're a big district, and in which case you might bring in a PD person at $1,500 a day, 6
Yes.
days, 9,000. If you're
Yes.
really tiny, I assume that you might be attending this type of PD in some kind of a consortia or groups of local districts getting together, I assume. Probably a lot of different ways to do this. The key, though, is it has to be done.
Absolutely. And I think right now, the different groups or organizations that are being approved to provide this training are just receiving that approval. And then they need a little time, obviously, to kind of lay out what those opportunities might look like. But yes, for us as a larger district, we'll bring it in-house.
And that's 24-25 because it's got to be done by July 1 of 25, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yep. And
Okay.
Yep. Next line will be a must do for all districts, and that is to do a state approved professional development for 5K through 3rd grade educators. You have to start this one by July 1, 2025. It doesn't need to be finished until July 1, 2026. And so you could spread this over 2 years. You could get it all done in, 24-25. You could wait, but that would be another requirement. And again, I made an estimate for that based on what it would typically cost us to bring in professional development to do that. So, and again, Fund 10 for us for that work.
Okay, so the timing shows it covering a couple of years, which would make sense in the context. And this is, I don't want this to get too far ahead of us, but the training, professional development, unlike the materials, doesn't have any kind of a reimbursement opportunity, right? So the default here is Fund 10, non-reimbursable on a PD. Again, there might be federal sources. And I've even heard, and this is, again, I don't want to go too far with this. I've heard that DPI might, if they're able to approach it, if they've got any leftover statewide gear or ESSER funds, I think they would like to help out if they can, but that's very soft at this point. Okay, what's next?
So the next is the creation of the personalized reading plan for students under the 25th percentile on your universal literacy screener. The plan itself can most likely be done by existing staff. So right now we have
Right.
Students who we generally support with tier 3 services for kids who are in the 10th percentile below. And so we'll need to think about likely classroom educators doing the tier 2 services and writing the plan, and then interventionist, reading specialist interventionist doing the tier 3 level plan. And it's recording a plan for each student who is at the 25th percentile below. That's then of course shared with parents and caregivers so they know what the plan is to be able to help kids move forward. So the plan itself is not likely going to be that costly, but of course it's going to, the line below is going to be what might impact staffing for some districts.
Well, I know that you thought that I was always just staring at the ceiling during your presentations and administrative meetings, but I do recall interventions for like the bottom 10%. That number sounds more. So is that changed? Is 25%? Is that where the cost might come in? Just more kids getting more intervention and more personal reading plans? Is that the idea?
Absolutely. And every district has different thresholds for the kids who receive different interventions. But I'd say in general, kids who are at the 10th percentile and below are getting tier 3 services. And those are a lot greater intensity on staff, right? That's not something you can do in a group of probably 5 and 6 kids from a classroom teacher. It's more difficult to be able to meet the needs of that. And so our approach will be more than likely that classroom teachers will deliver the tier 2 type interventions. And then the kids at 10% or below will typically have support from an intervention teacher. We shifted probably 2 or 3 years ago now to ensuring we had what we call what I need time, RTI block. Many of your districts will probably have that. And so during that RTI or EMLSS or WIN block, whatever you call it, that will likely be where some of that work occurs for the personalized reading plan, and then intervention for the kids at the 10% or below.
Okay. Okay, thank you. A new readiness screener probably means training and how to use the new screener, right? Is that the next one?
Absolutely. So the state will be absorbing the cost of the screener, but it will be about protecting time for staff to be trained on that, depending on if it's technology based, right? Like what that means for your team in the tech department to be able to get all the things prepared and ready to push out, your district assessment coordinator. So depending on what it is, if it's a screener we're already using, it will be status quo and just shifting some of the timelines that are required now by the state. For people using a different screener, it will be a shift altogether in supporting staff and how to use the screener. And then, of course, the important time to understand the data to be able to drive the instruction afterwards. So equally important is understanding what the data is saying and what that means for how we interact and support kids afterwards.
Got it. And then I guess we just got 2 lines left here, right? The diagnostic reading assessment for students under 24% on universal screener or by parent caregiver request, like district specific. It depends on how you're situated currently. And then the last line, local literacy.
Yeah, so that's the plan that's required for each district to create and post, and I'm assuming we'll be required to update it annually for what's our plan to be sure that we are meeting the evidence-based reading instructions. So for us, that will mean probably our ELA committee under the direction of administrators and our ELA coordinator will create that plan. I'm assuming it will need to be presented to the school board and then posted on our district website and noticed. And so again, staff time to create that, but that wouldn't have any other cost other than that I know of.
Okay, I apologize. I've gotten a little signal here that's saying my internet service is a little unstable right now. This happens every time it snows or rains, or whether it's sunny or windy. Usually, those are the conditions that will send that. Thank you to the good people at Charter Spectrum. Okay, so this is a layout of. I think this is for business managers the most important slide in the deck because it gives you a sense of proportion. And all kidding aside, our instructional colleagues are under the gun to make a lot of changes in a hurry. This is a chance for the business office folks to step up and be helpful, anticipate the needs, and work on the necessary budgetary adjustments to make this happen with in a way that's super supportive, right? Because it's got to be done. It is the law. So be
So Mike,
kind to your CNI director. Yes, Brian.
when I look at the list, I mean, when I look at it, it's probably 1.3 to 1.5 million dollars in overall cost, depending on if you're paying teachers for some of that paid PD or not. And when I run that through my brain to to reduce it for a district that's in the 500 to maybe 2,000 students, you're probably at 100,000 to 300,000, maybe a little bit more in cost. I mean, that's not universal because some people may be using the right curriculum. You know, some people may have just did that, but in my mind, that's what I would kind of be thinking of if I was in a district that size, that I need to think about where I'm going to get $100,000 to $300,000 from to pay for these things that need to be done.
Right. Right. Well, a big part of this webinar is awareness, right? We start here, and you got to start somewhere. So this is a really good overview of the types of cost categories. The amounts admittedly have to be prorated. Not a lot of 8,500 student school districts out there. The timing, I think, is super important too. When does this start? Again, a disclaimer on the funding sources. We defaulted to Fund 10. If you can find ways to use federal funds, all good. Okay. In terms of expenditures, well, it's just exactly what it says. At some point, School Financial Services, DPI, is going to end up assigning some kind of an project code to track these expenditures. Usually it's 600 at the state level, right? We all know this from our woofer training. But which 600 level number, we're not sure of just yet, but be aware of that. If you don't have a number yet, and you are already coding purchase orders, create your own project number, 900 something, that you can convert once the DPI puts a number out there for you. We just don't want you to lose track of what you're spending in regards to what's reimbursable under Act 20. Okay. So with that, I think we've just about hit our timeline, and I want to say happy spring break, happy basketball tournament watching, if that's a hobby of yours. I was disappointed to see that WASBO University didn't make it into the brackets again this year, despite the fact that I thought we had an outstanding season. So maybe next year. But until then, many of you are on break next week or the week after. So happy spring break to you. A special thank you to Stephanie Leonard for joining us here today from Sun Prairie. And thanks to all of you for joining us as well. And I think that'll do it for today. So we are out. Take care. Happy Friday.